What was life in Dark Age Britain really like? Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a time that most people imagine in shades of mud, mist, and the occasional rusty sword. Yes, Dark Age Britain. That vaguely defined patch of history where Rome had packed up and left, but no one else had quite figured out what to do with the island. The centuries where people tended to starve a lot, fight occasionally, and mostly just survive until they didn't. So, dim the lights, take a slow breath, and let's wander into a world of damp wooden halls, suspicious meat, and kings who sometimes ruled over little more than a village with a nice fence. Now, if you ask most people what Dark Age Britain means, you'll usually get a sort of cinematic haze: knights in dented armor, peasants looking perpetually damp, maybe a Saxon or two standing around in wolf pelts. But historically, this was roughly the 5th to 10th centuries. After the Romans abandoned Britain around the year 410, things didn't exactly collapse overnight. They more sagged. Like an old roof that leaks but doesn't bother to fall down. Imagine this: you're living in Roman Britain, and for centuries there have been paved roads, stone towns, taxes collected, usually in ways that annoyed you, but at least there was a system. Then one day, the legions just march away. Rome had bigger problems on the continent, like Germanic tribes, civil wars, and emperors who were less than competent. Britain, far from the center, was told essentially, good luck. Naturally, local elites tried to hold things together. And naturally, they didn't. What you get in the 5th century is a patchwork quilt of half Roman, half local leaders who declare themselves kings of whatever patch of farmland they happen to stand on. It's the sort of situation where one man's kingdom is another man's cow pasture. And while everyone was busy deciding whether to speak Latin, Celtic, or some kind of broken combination of both, the Saxons and Angles from across the sea started showing up. They didn't so much conquer at first, they were mercenaries invited in to help defend the locals. Which, in hindsight, was a terrible idea. Because mercenaries, as it turns out, don't always remain mercenaries. Sometimes, they look around, notice the land is nice, the climate is tolerable, and the natives seem manageable. So, they settle in. By the 6th century, we have Anglo-Saxon kingdoms sprouting like mushrooms across the damp soil of Britain. Kent, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, all those names you vaguely remember from high school maps start to appear. And if you lived in this period, what was your life like? Let's be honest. Grim. Housing was basic. Wooden huts, with a central fire for warmth and smoke that probably shortened your lifespan considerably. Roofs leaked. Floors were dirt. And yet, to the people living there, this was simply normal. A Roman villa with heated floors would have seemed like witchcraft. Food was another matter. You might get bread, coarse, dark, chewy stuff. If you were lucky, some meat, though it was usually salted or smoked beyond recognition. Cheese existed, though calling it cheese feels generous. Think of something vaguely curdled, with the texture of damp clay. Alcohol, though, alcohol was plentiful. Mead, ale, and whatever else could be brewed. Not because people were perpetually drunk, though many probably were, but because water wasn't always the safest option. It's better to be mildly tipsy than violently ill. Clothing was wool, endlessly wool. Diet if you were lucky, itchy if you weren't, which was most of the time. Shoes? Leather, if you could afford them. Otherwise, good luck with the mud. Now, royalty in this era had it only marginally better. Yes, they lived in larger halls and had more meat in their diet. They might even own a few luxuries, like a gilded brooch or a sword with an inlaid hilt. But they weren't living in castles yet, those came later. Kings slept in drafty timber halls, where the floor was just as muddy, and the fleas were just as active. The main difference was that a king could order his servants to scratch him while he pretended to look important. The politics were a mess. Think of Britain in this period less as a kingdom and more as a very dysfunctional family reunion. Every petty ruler claimed descent from some mythical ancestor, usually a god or a heroic warrior. Genealogies were invented at will, partly to impress followers and partly because, frankly, no one was going to fact-check them. When you tell people you're descended from Woden, the local equivalent of Odin, it's not like anyone can open a dusty scroll and prove you wrong. These kings fought each other constantly. land changed hands faster than medieval gossip. Alliances were forged and broken with the same level of seriousness as two children trading toys. And yet, this was the beginning of the England we know today, a messy, violent adolescence where nobody could quite decide who was in charge. Religion added another layer of confusion. The old Celtic pagan traditions lingered. The incoming Anglo-Saxons brought their own pagan gods. And Christianity, thanks to missionaries from both Ireland and Rome, was spreading as well. You could walk into one village where people prayed to Christ, wander into the next and find sacrifices to a tree, and then stumble into another where they politely did both, just to be safe. And while we often imagine Dark Age Britain as a land of warriors, most people weren't fighting at all. They were farming, endlessly farming. Wheat, barley, oats, anything that could survive the soggy soil. Sheep and pigs were common, though pigs were useful because they could root through the forest for food. Which meant your family pig was essentially a free-roaming vacuum cleaner. Until it was dinner. Life expectancy wasn't great. Child mortality was high. Disease was rampant. A cut could kill you if it festered. And winters were long and damp, leaving most people weak and hungry by spring. It's little wonder that legends like King Arthur emerged from this gloom. When your reality is mostly mud and coughing, the idea of a shining hero on horseback is downright therapeutic. Speaking of Arthur, let's touch on him briefly. Historically, there is no solid evidence for him. He might have been a real war leader, or several figures blurred into one, or just a story people like to tell around the fire. But the legend served a purpose. It gave people a sense of order and hope, even if it was entirely fictional. A bit like how modern people cling to inspirational quotes on Instagram. Now, socially, Dark Age Britain was a hierarchy. At the top, kings and nobles. Below them, warriors who served those kings. Below that, freemen, ordinary farmers who owned a little land. And at the very bottom, slaves. Yes, slavery was a thriving institution. People were captured in raids, sold across the sea, and forced into labor. It wasn't racialized in the way later slavery would be, it was more about who lost the last battle. Unfortunate for them, convenient for their new master. Law and order was flexible. Each kingdom had its own customs. If you stole something, you might be fined, mutilated, or simply killed, depending on who caught you and what mood they were in. Blood feuds were common. If someone killed your cousin, your family was expected to kill theirs. This could spiral endlessly, unless both sides agreed to compensation, usually in the form of livestock. Sheep, the universal currency of the Dark Ages. Now, one thing people underestimate about this period is literacy. Most people couldn't read or write, of course. But monasteries were beginning to emerge as little islands of learning. Monks copied manuscripts, sometimes illuminating them with dazzling designs, often while muttering about how cold and miserable they were. Because yes, even the holy men spent much of their time freezing in drafty stone buildings, hunched over parchment, wondering why God had cursed them with such terrible pens. The landscape itself was different from what we imagine today. Much of Britain was still heavily forested. Villages were isolated, roads were rough, and travel was slow. A journey of 50 miles could take days, assuming you didn't get lost, robbed, or stuck in a bog. Which, incidentally, happened often enough that archaeologists still find the occasional unfortunate skeleton down there. So, what was life in Dark Age Britain really like? It was muddy, cold, and often brutal. But it was also a period where small communities clung together, where myths grew in importance, and where the seeds of later kingdoms were sown. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic. But it was real, lived day by day, in smoke-filled huts and drafty halls. And while we romanticize it now, with images of knights, quests, and noble kings, most people then would probably have just wanted a warm blanket, a full stomach, and perhaps a roof that didn't drip on their forehead at night. Let's drift now, away from the general picture, and towards some of the actual characters who stumbled their way through this damp little island. Because if there's one thing the Dark Ages had in abundance, it was leaders who were spectacularly unfit for the job. The early Saxon kings and their beautifully bad ideas. So, having wandered through the misty basics of Dark Age Britain, let's now tiptoe into the lives of the people who, for better or worse, were in charge. The kings. Those noble figures who, according to later chronicles, were descended from gods, warriors, or sometimes suspiciously convenient brothers who happened to survive when everyone else mysteriously didn't. Our first stop is Kent, because Kent tends to show up early in everything. Thanks to its location, it was the front door of Britain, the bit sticking out toward the continent like a welcome mat for anyone with a boat. Which, naturally, included the Saxons. One of the earliest kings of Kent was Hengist. Now, was Hengist a real person? Hard to say. He may have been a flesh and blood leader, or he may have been a legendary stand-in for an entire wave of settlers. The chronicles say Hengist and his brother Horsa came over in the mid-5th century, hired as mercenaries by the native Britons. Hired to fight off the Picts, those cheerful people in the north who specialized in painting themselves blue and ruining everyone else's day. And, because of course this was going to happen, the mercenaries decided they liked Britain so much that they'd just keep it. Hengist supposedly betrayed his British hosts, seized land, and set himself up as king. It's the classic job interview that ends with the candidate stealing your chair, your desk, and your lunch. His name, Hengist, means stallion, while his brother's name, Horsa, means horse. Which makes you wonder if their parents were running out of ideas. Imagine introducing yourself at a royal gathering. Yes, this is my brother. Horse. Subtle. Regal. Utterly unoriginal. Whether they were real or not, Kent became the first clear Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Its rulers married strategically, traded across the channel, and generally tried to act more sophisticated than the damp surroundings suggested. One of the later kings, Ethelbert of Kent, is worth pausing on. He reigned around the late 6th century and has the distinction of being the first Anglo-Saxon king to convert to Christianity. Which sounds noble, until you realize it was mostly because his wife was Frankish and already Christian. And when your powerful in-laws are across the channel, telling you about heaven and hell over dinner, you tend to nod politely and go along with it. Ethelbert invited Augustine of Canterbury, the missionary sent by the Pope, and that's how Kent started down the Christian road. This gave Ethelbert prestige, of course. It also gave him the chance to look slightly more legitimate than his rivals, since nothing says respect me quite like papal approval. But don't imagine his court was a beacon of light and literacy. It was still smoky halls, mead spilled everywhere, and warriors shouting loudly while gnawing questionable cuts of meat. Christianity was more of a decorative layer, like throwing a thin tablecloth over a table that's permanently sticky. Now, while Kent was busy with religion, another kingdom, Northumbria, was busy being a complete mess. Northumbria was the northern powerhouse of the Anglo-Saxon world, and its rulers were spectacularly dysfunctional in ways that feel almost modern. Take King Edwin, for example. He ruled in the early 7th century, and his life was basically one long attempt not to get murdered. He was exiled as a child, shuffled between rival courts, and constantly at risk of assassination. Eventually, he clawed his way back and became king. And, because trends were fashionable even then, he too converted to Christianity. Partly for politics, partly because it's easier to get support from Rome than from whichever pagan god happens to be haunting your local oak tree. Edwin's downfall, though, came courtesy of battle. He fought against the combined forces of Gwynedd and Mercia, two kingdoms who decided that Edwin looked a bit too smug. The Battle of Hatfield Chase in 633 went spectacularly badly for him. Edwin was killed, and his head ended up in York. Displayed nicely, of course. Because in the Dark Ages, trophies weren't medals or plaques, they were severed body parts. Northumbria lurched on after him, producing kings with names that seemed specifically designed to trip up modern readers. Oswald, Oswiu, Edgefrith, each one trying to hold together a patchwork of loyalties while fending off enemies on all sides. And naturally, the family tree looked like something scribbled by a drunk spider. Brothers murdered brothers. Cousins betrayed cousins. Marriages were arranged, broken, and rearranged, usually with a trail of corpses in the background. Take King Oswiu. He spent much of his reign switching between piety and political brutality, as though unsure whether he wanted to be remembered as a saint or a warlord. In one famous council, the Synod of Whitby, he helped decide whether Northumbria would follow Roman Christianity or the Irish Celtic version. It was less about theology and more about hairstyle. The Irish monks had their own way of shaving the head, while the Romans insisted theirs was better. Oswiu, after listening to long speeches about heaven, hell, and hairlines, finally declared he'd rather follow Rome. Why? Because he didn't want to risk offending St. Peter, who supposedly held the keys to heaven. Practical man. And yet, while these rulers squabbled over religion, their kingdoms were fragile. Northumbrian kings tended to die in battle with alarming regularity. Oswald died fighting the Mercians. Edgeworth died fighting the Picts. It was almost a tradition: take the throne, gather some troops, march north, and promptly get killed. Not exactly a sustainable model of governance. Speaking of Mercia, let's wander there next. Mercia was the Middle Kingdom. Literally, the name means border people. Situated in the heart of England, it was surrounded by rivals, which may explain why its rulers developed a particular fondness for being ruthless. One of its most famous kings, Penda, was a proudly pagan warlord in the 7th century. While his neighbors converted to Christianity, Penda stuck with the old gods and seemed to enjoy reminding people of it. He fought constantly, sometimes against Northumbria, sometimes against Wessex, occasionally against everyone at once. And, surprisingly, he often won. For decades, he was the terror of the island, marching around with the confidence of a man who had never read the phrase "don't bite off more than you can chew." But even Penda eventually found his limit. In 655, he faced Oswiu of Northumbria at the Battle of the Wynwade. Despite having the larger army, Penda lost badly, probably because half his allies abandoned him mid-battle. The result? Penda was killed, and Mercia's power crumbled. Yet, for a time, he had been the last great pagan king of England. A sort of stubborn holdout, shaking his fist at the tide of Christianity until the tide inevitably drowned him. And then, of course, there was Wessex. Wessex would eventually become the dominant kingdom of England, but in the early centuries it was just another squabbling patch of land with kings who mostly came and went. Early rulers like Cerdic may or may not have existed. It's possible he was more legend than man. But the dynasty that claimed him as their ancestor lasted for centuries, so perhaps that was the real achievement: invent a mythical founder, then use his name like a brand label for generations. Life at these royal courts was not especially glamorous. A palace was essentially a large timber hall with a thatched roof, packed with smoke, noise, and smells. The king sat on a slightly bigger chair than everyone else, which was the main indicator of authority. Meals were communal, great slabs of meat, bread, ale passed around. Entertainment came from bards singing long, occasionally tedious poems about ancestors who may or may not have been real. Everyone laughed at the appropriate moments, not because the stories were funny, but because the bard was also probably armed. And yet, within this smoky chaos, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were slowly stabilizing. By the 8th century, Mercia rose again under kings like Offa, who built a giant earthwork, Offa's Dyke, across the border with Wales. Not a wall to keep people out so much as a very large, very expensive way of saying, "this is mine." Offa also minted coins, corresponded with Charlemagne, and generally tried to behave like a proper European monarch. Except, of course, his court was still full of mud, fleas, and warriors arguing about who stole whose cow. These early kings were not visionaries. They didn't build castles, they didn't draft constitutions, and they certainly didn't bathe often. What they did do was fight, marry strategically, and hope their heirs survived long enough to carry on the family line. Many didn't. Child mortality didn't spare royals, and succession disputes were so common that one wonders how anyone kept track. So, what was life like for a Saxon king? Imagine being slightly better fed than your subjects, slightly better dressed, but living in constant fear of being poisoned, stabbed, or betrayed by your closest kin. Not exactly restful. The crown was not a glittering jewel, it was more like a heavy, flea-infested cloak that could slip off at any moment. And yet, from this chaos, the foundations of England were laid. The kingdoms bickered, merged, split, and merged again, until eventually one would rise to dominate. But before that, there were centuries of messy, damp, faintly ridiculous politics. Let's drift onward now, toward the later Saxon rulers, the ones who started imagining themselves as kings of all England. Some managed it briefly. Others failed spectacularly. And nearly all of them had personal lives that make for excellent bedtime stories. The rise of Wessex and the kings who couldn't catch a break. So, let's drift now into the story of Wessex. That corner of southern England that started out as just another muddy kingdom and somehow ended up as the last one standing. Which, frankly, was less about destiny and more about being just competent enough to outlast the competition. Wessex begins with a shadowy figure named Cerdic, supposedly arriving in Britain around the early 6th century. Historians can't decide if he was real, mythical, or just an unusually charismatic farmer. But his descendants certainly thought he was real, because they traced their royal line back to him like children clinging to a family tree doodled in crayon. The irony is that Cerdic's name looks suspiciously Celtic, not Saxon, suggesting that the so-called founder of Anglo-Saxon Wessex may have been, at least partly British. Which is a little like bragging that your dynasty comes from purebred wolves, only to realize the family pet was actually half sheepdog. Still, the legend stuck. And over the centuries, Wessex kings clung to Cerdic as their ancestor, using him as a kind of royal logo. Imagine a long-running soap opera where no one remembers the pilot episode clearly, but everyone insists it was brilliant. Now, the early kings of Wessex didn't have an easy time. They were constantly fighting their neighbors, Mercia to the north, Kent to the east, Cornwall to the west. Cornwall in particular was stubborn, full of Celtic warriors who didn't take kindly to Saxon expansion. So, the kings of Wessex spent much of their time trudging around in the rain, trying to conquer land that never quite stayed conquered. One such king was Cynegiles, who ruled in the early 7th century. His big claim to fame was converting to Christianity, again under the influence of missionaries. The chroniclers tell us he was baptized with none other than King Oswald of Northumbria standing as his godfather. A very wholesome omen, if you ignore the fact that both of them spent much of their lives stabbing rival kings. Nothing says spiritual renewal like a baptism performed by your occasional battlefield ally. But if Cynegiles gets remembered for conversion, his successors mostly get remembered for dying inconveniently. Battle after battle chipped away at Wessex. The Mercians bullied them. The Welsh resisted them. And just when Wessex seemed to be finding its footing, another wave of chaos arrived, the Vikings. The 9th century was the age when longships started gliding ominously up rivers, carrying men who had very little interest in subtlety. They came for loot, for land, and occasionally for the sheer joy of ruining someone else's monastery. Because monasteries, with their shiny chalices and limited security systems, were irresistible targets. Wessex was hit hard. Kings before Alfred, like Ethelwulf and his sons, faced wave after wave of Viking armies. Some tried to fight. Some tried to buy peace with silver. Spoiler, buying peace from Vikings is like paying rent on a leaky roof. It works temporarily, but the problem always comes back, usually wetter and angrier. Ethelwulf himself is a curious figure. He ruled from 839 to 858 and is mostly remembered for being pious and not especially dynamic. He went on pilgrimage to Rome, which sounds noble, until you realize that leaving your kingdom during a Viking crisis is a bit like abandoning your house during a fire because you wanted to admire the architecture next door. His reign was fine. Not disastrous, not inspiring. The sort of kingship you'd rate as adequate on a medieval Yelp review. His sons, however, had more dramatic fates. Ethelbald, for instance, managed to cause scandal by marrying his own stepmother. To clarify, when his father Ethelwulf died, the widow, Judith, was still young and attractive. Ethelbald decided she would make an excellent wife. It was frowned upon, even in the Dark Ages, though admittedly not enough to stop him. He died a couple of years later, childless. Possibly of shame, though more likely of disease. Another son, Ethelbert, ruled briefly and did very little of note, other than not causing scandal. Which, frankly, was an achievement in itself. But the real story begins with Alfred. Alfred the Great, as later generations insisted on calling him. Which is amusing, because during his lifetime he spent a great deal of it on the run, hiding in marshes, and occasionally burning cakes. Not exactly the image of a triumphant monarch. Alfred came to power in the late 9th century, at a time when the Vikings were swarming southern England. They had already conquered Northumbria and East Anglia, leaving Wessex as the last major Anglo-Saxon kingdom still standing. It was, in short, a disaster. At first, Alfred didn't cope well. In 878, he was driven into hiding by a Viking army. The story goes that he stayed incognito in the marshes of Somerset, at the home of a peasant woman who didn't recognize him as king. She asked him to watch the cakes baking on the fire, and, lost in thought, he let them burn. When she returned, she scolded him, and Alfred, in the humiliating position of being a king told off like a lazy teenager, meekly apologized. Whether the story is true hardly matters. It paints the picture of a king who, despite being the great, could not be trusted with basic kitchen tasks. Yet, Alfred did recover. From the marshes, he rallied his followers, built a more organized army, and eventually defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Edington. The result was the Treaty of Wedmore, which split England between the Anglo-Saxons in the south and the Vikings in the north and east. Not exactly a glorious victory, but at least Wessex survived. Alfred's greatness, if we must call it that, lay less in military brilliance and more in administration. He reorganized defenses, built fortified towns called Bez, and invested in education. He personally translated texts into Old English, perhaps realizing that if no one else was going to read them, he might as well. His reign left Wessex with something resembling stability, which in the Dark Ages was practically a miracle. But Alfred also suffered from ill health. Chroniclers describe him as plagued by some mysterious disease, possibly Crohn's, possibly hemorrhoids, possibly something else unpleasant. Which meant that much of his greatness was achieved while he was doubled over in discomfort. Imagine ruling a kingdom, fighting Vikings, translating Latin texts, and all the while feeling like your intestines were staging a coup. After Alfred came his son Edward the Elder. And here's where Wessex really started expanding. Edward, along with his sister Ethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, pushed back against the Vikings, reclaiming territory bit by bit. Ethelflaed, in particular, deserves credit. Widowed young, she ruled Mercia in her own right, built fortifications, and led armies. Chroniclers sometimes try to downplay her, but the truth is, she was one of the most competent rulers of the entire period. Her brother Edward may have been king, but she was the one people actually respected. Edward himself was effective but less glamorous. His reign was a steady grind of warfare, building, and occasionally marrying the wrong people. He had several wives, producing a truly confusing number of children, many of whom would later squabble over the throne like toddlers fighting over toys. And then, of course, came Athelstan. Alfred's grandson, Edward's son. Athelstan is often credited as the first true king of England, though calling him that might be a bit generous. He did manage to unite much of the country under his rule, defeating a massive coalition of Scots, Vikings, and others at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937. Chroniclers praised him endlessly. Later generations remembered him as a model king. Which probably means he was only slightly less flawed than everyone else. But even Athelstan wasn't immune to the quirks of the age. He never married, which has led to endless speculation. Some suggest he was deeply pious. Others whisper he may have been uninterested in women altogether. Whatever the reason, he left no heirs, which meant the carefully constructed unity he built promptly fell apart after his death. This is the curse of Wessex kings. They built, fought, and schemed, but the moment a strong one died, everything unraveled. His heirs would bicker, rivals would seize land, and before long, all the supposed unity looked more like a particularly ugly patchwork quilt again. Still, Wessex endured. Through Alfred, Edward, Ethelflaed, and Athelstan, it became the core around which England would eventually form. Not because its kings were uniquely brilliant, most weren't, but because, somehow, they managed not to collapse entirely. Which, in the Dark Ages, was as good as greatness. So, the rise of Wessex was less a story of shining triumph and more a story of stubborn survival. Of kings who couldn't catch a break, but who muddled through anyway. Their halls were smoky, their health was poor, their politics were messy. And yet, without them, there would be no England. Let's drift onward now, to the later Anglo-Saxon kings. The ones who had to deal with renewed Viking invasions, court scandals, and the occasional complete breakdown of royal authority. Spoiler, one of them was so incompetent he's still remembered today by his nickname, the Unready. Athelred the Unready in the Return of the Vikings. So, we've seen Wessex stumble its way toward dominance, through Alfred, Edward, and Athelstan. For a brief moment, England looked like it might actually hold together. And then, well, then came a spectacular unraveling. Because if there's one thing English history loves, it's a ruler who ruins everything. Enter Athelred, nicknamed the Unready. Now, let's pause here, because the nickname deserves a bit of unpacking. Unready didn't originally mean what it sounds like in modern English, like he was late to every battle, fumbling with his shoes. The Old English word was unrayed, meaning bad counsel or poorly advised. Which still doesn't make him look great. In fact, it may be worse. It suggests that everyone around him was either giving terrible advice, or he was spectacularly bad at listening. And judging by the results, it was probably both. Athelred came to the throne in 978, at around 12 years old, after the suspicious death of his older half-brother, King Edward, later known as Edward the Martyr. And yes, when someone gets nicknamed the Martyr, you can assume their death was less than natural. Edward was stabbed while visiting his stepmother, who happened to be Ethelred's mother. The details are murky, but let's just say Ethelred's accession was accompanied by a cloud of guilt and the faint sound of knives being hastily washed. A boy king in a violent age was never going to have it easy. And poor Athelred started as he meant to go on, confused, manipulated, and perpetually under siege. His reign was defined by the return of the Vikings, who had been relatively quiet for a few decades but now came back with enthusiasm, as if they had discovered an old holiday destination worth revisiting. The Vikings of Ethelred's era weren't just small raiding parties. They were organized armies, often entire fleets of longships. They had figured out that England was wealthy, weakly defended, and conveniently close. And so, they came back, again and again, like very determined salesmen. Ethelred's response? He paid them off. Over and over and over again. These payments were called Danegeld. Essentially, please go away, here's a bag of silver. Which, naturally, encouraged them to come back the next year for another bag of silver. It's the medieval equivalent of feeding a stray cat and then being surprised when it refuses to leave your porch. The sums were staggering. In 991, after a Viking victory at the Battle of Maldon, Athelred paid 10,000 pounds of silver. A few years later, 22,000. Then 24,000. By the early 11th century, he was handing over 48,000 pounds. England's economy was being drained, not by war, but by the royal treasury's inability to say no. To be fair, it wasn't entirely Ethelred's fault. His advisors pushed him in this direction, arguing that it was cheaper than fighting. But still, it gave Athelred the reputation of a king who couldn't handle the pressure. He was like a homeowner who, instead of fixing a leaky roof, just puts down more buckets and hopes for the best. And then came his most infamous decision, the St. Brice's Day Massacre. In 1002, perhaps tired of paying endless Danegeld, Athelred ordered the killing of all Danes living in England. This was less a strategic masterstroke and more a royal tantrum. The massacre was brutal, but incomplete. Many Danes survived, and among the dead was the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, the King of Denmark. Which meant Athelred hadn't solved the Viking problem. He'd just made it personal. Sweyn responded the way you'd expect a Viking king to respond. He invaded. Over the next decade, his armies ravaged England with increasing ferocity. Athelred, true to form, vacillated between resistance and more payments. His nickname of the Unready felt more accurate by the year. By 1013, Sweyn had conquered almost the entire country. Athelred fled to Normandy, yes, the same Normandy that would later send William the Conqueror. In fact, Ethelred's wife, Emma of Normandy, was from there. So he retreated to his in-laws, leaving his kingdom in Viking hands. Sweyn became King of England. But fate, in its usual unpredictable way, intervened. Sweyn died suddenly in 1014, after just a few months on the throne. The Anglo-Saxons invited Athelred back, perhaps thinking he had learned something in exile. Spoiler, he had not. His second reign was just as chaotic as the first, full of mistrust, poor decisions, and renewed Viking attacks. He finally died in 1016, after nearly 4 decades of reign, leaving England in ruins. His son, Edmund Ironside, briefly tried to rally resistance but was overwhelmed by Sweyn's son, Nut. Yes, that Nut, the famous Canute of legend, who supposedly tried to command the sea to retreat. We'll come to him in a moment. But let's linger on Athelred a little longer, because he deserves to be appreciated as one of history's great examples of how not to rule. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't lazy. He simply never managed to make a decisive move that worked. Every action seemed to make things worse. He paid Danegeld, Vikings came back. He ordered a massacre, it provoked invasion. He fled, his kingdom fell. He returned, his subjects groaned. He died, and everyone else was left to pick up the pieces. His personal life didn't help. He fathered a large brood of children by different wives, setting the stage for dynastic squabbles after his death. His second wife, Emma of Normandy, was a formidable woman who would outlive him and play a major role in later politics. She was shrewd, ambitious, and apparently far more competent than her hapless husband. Which may explain why she ended up married to 2 kings, mother to 2 more, and grandmother to yet another. Emma was like a one-woman dynastic insurance policy. So, Ethelred's reign was a catastrophe. But it was also an important turning point. His failures cleared the way for a new dynasty, the Danish kings of England. And their story is worth a slow meander. Now, let's drift gently toward Nut, son of Sweyn Forkbeard, conqueror of England. A Viking who somehow managed to transform himself into a respected Christian king. And a man whose legacy includes one of the most misunderstood anecdotes in history, the whole business with the sea. But before we get to Nut, pause for a moment and picture late Anglo-Saxon England under Athelred. The villages burned by Viking raids. The endless flow of silver leaving the treasury. The confused, panicked king staring at maps and wondering why nothing ever went right. It was a land in turmoil, waiting for someone, anyone, to bring a semblance of stability. Athelred could not provide it. But the Vikings, oddly enough, would. Not the great and the Viking kings of England. So, Athelred has left the stage, somewhat reluctantly, and England is in chaos. The Vikings are no longer just raiders. They're rulers now. And the man who embodies this transformation is Nut. Or, as he is often styled in a slightly grander spelling, Canute. Son of Sweyn Forkbeard. Conqueror of England. And, surprisingly, a pretty competent monarch, at least compared to the string of disasters who had come before. Nut arrived on the English scene in 1015, fresh from his father's conquest. Sweyn had died abruptly, which left his young son to pick up where he had left off. It wasn't an easy inheritance. England was restless, divided, and exhausted. Athelred was still technically king, although mostly in name, and his son Edmund Ironside was ready to resist with what remained of Anglo-Saxon pride. The conflict between Nut and Edmund is one of those moments where English history briefly flirts with drama, before inevitably collapsing into compromise. The two clashed in a series of battles, Ashington being the most famous, in which Nut usually came out on top. Edmund fought fiercely, earning his nickname of Ironside, but his cause was hopelessly undermined by betrayal among his own nobles. Because, naturally, many of them were more interested in cutting deals with the invaders than in dying for the Anglo-Saxon crown. By late 1016, the situation was grim. Athelred had died in April of that year, which, one imagines, prompted more relief than mourning. Edmund carried on the fight alone, until the inevitable compromise was reached. England was split between them. Edmund kept Wessex, the Anglo-Saxon heartland, while Nut took the rest. It was a tense, fragile arrangement that lasted only a matter of weeks. Because in November of 1016, Edmund suddenly died. Possibly of wounds, possibly of something more suspicious. It's hard not to notice how convenient his death was for Nut. Let's just say Nut didn't shed many tears. And so, at barely 20 years old, Nut became king of all England. Now, the image that usually comes to mind when you think Viking king of England is a wild-haired brute, bellowing in a smoky hall while hurling axes for sport. But Nut was not that. At least, not anymore. He had learned that conquering a kingdom is only half the job. Keeping it is the real challenge. And oddly enough, Nut turned out to be remarkably good at it. For one thing, he married wisely. Remember Emma of Normandy, Ethelred's widow? Nut promptly married her. This was a clever move on several levels. First, it tied him to the old royal line, giving him a veneer of legitimacy. Second, it secured the alliance of Normandy, which was becoming increasingly important in the region. And third, Emma herself was no fool. She was ambitious, politically savvy, and willing to play the long game. Marrying her was like hiring a particularly effective political strategist. Nut also managed to balance his Viking followers with his new English subjects. He didn't try to impose Scandinavian customs wholesale, which would have alienated everyone. Instead, he presented himself as a proper Christian king. He went on pilgrimages. He donated lavishly to the church. He even had himself buried in Winchester, the traditional capital of Anglo-Saxon kings, rather than in Denmark. It was a calculated act of blending cultures, enough Viking toughness to keep his warriors happy, enough English tradition to calm the locals. And it worked. Nut's reign brought a surprising degree of stability. England, so recently ravaged by raids, was now part of a powerful North Sea empire. Because Nut wasn't just king of England. He also ruled Denmark, and later Norway. At his height, he controlled a swath of territory stretching across northern Europe, bound together not by flimsy dynastic claims, but by actual power. He was, in effect, the first ruler to knit England into a larger international network. Now, let's linger on the most famous story about him. The one everyone knows, Nut in the Sea. The tale goes that he sat on the shore, commanded the tide not to rise, and of course, the sea ignored him. The story is usually told as proof of his arrogance, as if he really thought the ocean would obey. But the truth is almost the opposite. The earliest accounts suggest that Nut staged the whole thing as a demonstration of humility. The point was to show his courtiers that even a king's power had limits, that only God could control the tides. Which is, frankly, a lot less entertaining than imagining a furious Viking king shouting at the waves. But it does make him look more thoughtful. Of course, thoughtful or not, Nut was still capable of ruthless practicality. Rivals were quietly removed. Potential threats were neutralized. He rewarded loyalty generously, and punished betrayal without hesitation. He may have worn the mantle of a Christian monarch, but underneath, he was still a Viking who understood that fear was a useful tool of government. Interestingly, his reign also marked a kind of cultural cross-pollination. Scandinavian settlers merged with Anglo-Saxon communities, leaving traces in language, law, and local traditions. If you live in the north or east of England today, many of your town names, those ending in by or Thorpe, are legacies of this era. Everyday English absorbed Norse words as well. In a way, Nut's rule was less about subjugation and more about blending, however uneasily. Nut ruled England for nearly 20 years, from 1016 until his death in 1035. And for much of that time, he was genuinely respected. Foreign envoys noted his wisdom. The church praised his generosity. Even later chroniclers, who tended to dislike foreign conquerors, often admitted that he was an effective ruler. Which is remarkable, considering that his father had only managed to sit on the throne for a few weeks. But of course, this being medieval monarchy, the real trouble came after his death. Nut had multiple sons by different women, because of course he did, and they all wanted a slice of the inheritance. Emma of Normandy, his clever queen, maneuvered to secure the throne for her children, but rival factions backed others. What followed was yet another round of instability, short reigns, and untimely deaths. Harold Harefoot, Nut's son by an earlier marriage, ruled briefly but without distinction. Emma's son, Harthacnut, eventually took over, but died young and childless. The entire Danish dynasty in England burned out within a generation, leaving behind little more than a historical footnote and some place names. It was one of those dynastic fireworks displays, bright, loud, and over far too quickly. Still, for that brief moment, under Nut, England was part of something larger. A stable, prosperous kingdom within a Viking empire. It didn't last, but then again, very little in this period ever did. And so, as the Viking era in England faded, attention shifted back to the old Anglo-Saxon line. Specifically, to Edward the Confessor, the son of Athelred and Emma, who returned from exile in Normandy to take the throne. His reign would be marked less by Viking raids and more by Norman influence, laying the foundations for the next great upheaval, the Norman conquest. But before we drift toward Edward, let's pause with Nut one more time. Picture him, not as a caricatured Viking in a horned helmet, that image is pure fantasy, but as a young, shrewd ruler, sitting on the throne of Winchester. A king who learned that brute force can win a crown, but wisdom, compromise, and the occasional staged lesson about the sea are what keep it. Not the Great. The Viking who became an Englishman. The conqueror who, improbably, gave England one of its rare intervals of peace. Edward the Confessor and the last Anglo-Saxon king. So, the Danish experiment in ruling England has burned itself out. Not the Great managed to keep everything together, but his sons, predictably, could not. Harold Harefoot died young. Harthacnut choked himself out of existence at a wedding feast, literally collapsing after a toast. And so the throne, somewhat astonishingly, circled back to the old royal line. Enter Edward. Known to history as Edward the Confessor. Which is a nickname that sounds very holy and serene, but is really just a polite way of saying, this man was not cut out for ruling. Edward wasn't a warrior. He wasn't even much of an administrator. He was pious, gentle, often indecisive. A king who spent more time at church than in council. Which, depending on your perspective, was either charming or catastrophic. Edward had spent most of his life in exile, growing up in Normandy after his father, Athelred the Unready, lost the throne. That meant he was steeped in Norman culture, Norman manners, and Norman politics. By the time he returned to England to become king in 1042, he was in his late 30s, a surprisingly advanced age for the era, and more Norman than Anglo-Saxon in outlook. This, naturally, caused problems. England was still Anglo-Saxon at its core, proud of its Wessex heritage, but its king spoke French, relied on Norman advisors, and seemed faintly baffled by his own people. Imagine a monarch who comes back after decades abroad, immediately surrounds himself with foreign favorites, and then wonders why everyone is glaring at him. Edward's reign was, therefore, marked by a constant tug-of-war between the native English nobility and his imported Norman allies. Chief among the English magnates were the Godwin family of Wessex, led by Earl Godwin, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Godwin had little patience for Norman influence and quickly set himself up as Edward's counterbalance. For years, the two sides circled each other, sometimes cooperating, sometimes at open odds. One particularly memorable quarrel came in 1051, when Edward tried to push his Norman favorites into key positions. Godwin resisted, tensions boiled over, and Edward actually exiled Godwin and his sons. It looked like the king might finally break free of native domination. But within a year, Godwin returned at the head of an army, and the people sided with him. Edward had no choice but to back down. Godwin was restored, and Edward's brief experiment in Normanizing his court was, for the moment, over. What this episode revealed was Edward's weakness. He had a crown, but little actual control. The real power lay with the great earls, especially the Godwins. Edward was more of a figurehead, presiding over a kingdom that he barely shaped. He may have been the confessor, but he was also, in practical terms, the avoider of decisions. His personal life didn't exactly inspire confidence either. Edward married Edith, the daughter of Godwin. It was a political match, designed to smooth relations. But the marriage remained childless. Some chroniclers suggest Edward took a vow of chastity, refusing to consummate the union. Others think it was simply infertility. Either way, it meant Edward left no heir, setting the stage for one of the most famous succession crises in history. In the meantime, Edward busied himself with his great passion, religion. He poured resources into churches and monasteries. His crowning achievement, quite literally, was the construction of Westminster Abbey. Not the Gothic structure we see today, that came later, but an earlier Romanesque version, begun under Edward's orders and consecrated just a week before his death. It was here that he was buried, and here that English coronations would take place for centuries afterward. So, while Edward may not have been much of a ruler, he did leave an enduring architectural legacy. Now, it's tempting to paint Edward as a sort of harmless, saintly figure drifting through the throne room while the earls squabbled around him. And to some extent, that's accurate. He was canonized in 1161, officially declared a saint, and remembered as one of the last Anglo-Saxon holy kings. But sainthood often disguises mediocrity. His reign, though peaceful in patches, failed to resolve the looming problems of succession and foreign influence. And those problems were very real. By the later years of his rule, Edward seems to have dangled promises of succession to multiple parties, perhaps in a misguided attempt to keep everyone happy. At some point, he allegedly promised the crown to William, Duke of Normandy, his distant relative and occasional ally. But he also relied heavily on the Godwins, particularly Harold Godwin's son, who became effectively the most powerful man in England by the 1060s. To make matters more confusing, there's evidence Edward may also have indicated support for the claim of Edgar the Atheling, a distant Anglo-Saxon royal heir. In short, Edward left behind a tangle. A kingdom with no clear successor, divided loyalties, and ambitious foreign claimants waiting in the wings. Which is not what you want when your crown is one of the most coveted prizes in Europe. Edward died in January 1066. His body was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, just as the fresh mortar of his great church was drying. He left no children, no clear heir, and a kingdom on the brink. Within hours, Harold Godwin's son seized the throne, claiming Edward had named him successor on his deathbed. Whether that was true or not, we'll never know. What we do know is that Harold's reign would last all of 9 months before ending in an arrow to the eye. But let's not rush ahead. Let's linger for a moment on Edward the Confessor. Picture him in his abbey, pale and contemplative, fingering a rosary while his earls bicker over land and power. A man more at ease in prayer than in politics. A king remembered not for battles won or lost past, but for his piety, his indecisiveness, and the abbey that would become the heart of English coronation ritual. Edward was, in many ways, the calm before the storm. A quiet, hesitant ruler presiding over a kingdom about to be violently transformed. The last Anglo-Saxon king to rule in peace, and the man whose failures opened the door to the Normans. So, as the candlelight of his reign fades, the scene shifts. The throne is empty. Harold Godwin's son steps forward to claim it. But in Normandy, William is watching. And in the north, Harald Hardrada of Norway is sharpening his swords. England is about to face the year 1066, a year so eventful it almost feels designed to keep schoolchildren miserable for centuries. But that is for the next part. For now, we let Edward the Confessor rest in his abbey. A king who preferred prayers to politics, and who left England teetering on the edge of its greatest upheaval. 1066 and the Norman Conquest. So, Edward the Confessor is gone. His crown has no clear heir, which, as we've already established, is the medieval equivalent of leaving a stake unattended at a wolf convention. The moment Edward was buried in Westminster Abbey, everyone with even the faintest whiff of a claim began sharpening their swords and practicing their best that was promised to meet speeches. Harold Godwin's son, Earl of Wessex and the most powerful man in England, didn't waste time. On January 6, 1066, the day after Edward's death, he was crowned king. He claimed that Edward had designated him as heir on his deathbed, and really, who was left to argue? Harold had the backing of the English nobility, the church, and the army. Which sounds impressive, until you realize he also had the immediate hatred of two extremely determined rivals. The first rival was William, Duke of Normandy. Edward had grown up in Normandy, and during his reign had made a number of gestures toward his Norman relatives. William claimed Edward had promised him the throne years earlier, and, whether or not that was true, William wasn't the sort to shrug and let things go. He was ambitious, ruthless, and patient. He also claimed Harold himself had sworn an oath to support William's claim during a visit to Normandy, though the details are conveniently vague. In any case, William saw Harold's coronation as theft, and he began preparing to invade. The second rival was Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, known to his admirers as the last great Viking. His claim was thinner, based on an old treaty between the kings of Denmark and Norway, but he didn't really care. Hardrada's philosophy was simple: if you can invade it, you can rule it. And besides, he had a reputation to uphold. After all, you don't get called the Thunderbolt of the North for staying at home. So poor Harold Godwin's son had barely settled into the throne before he was facing the prospect of 2 full-scale invasions, one from the north, one from across the channel. And because fate has an impeccable sense of humor, they didn't come one at a time. They came almost simultaneously. Harold Hardrada struck first. In September 1066, he sailed to England with a massive fleet, joined by Harold Godwinson's own estranged brother, Tostig. Yes, Harold's brother was helping to overthrow him. Because medieval sibling loyalty was, let's be honest, not the strongest of bonds. The Viking army landed in Yorkshire and met the English forces at Fulford, near York. The Norwegians crushed the local defenders. For a moment, it looked like the north of England would fall to Hardrada with ease. But Harold Godwin's son moved with surprising speed. He marched his army nearly 200 miles in just 4 days, an exhausting pace even by modern standards, and caught the Vikings at Stamford Bridge on September 25th. The battle that followed was brutal. Chroniclers tell of a lone Viking holding the bridge against the English, cutting down dozens before being speared from underneath. Hardrada himself was killed in the fighting, along with Tostig. The Norwegians were annihilated. Only a handful of ships limped back to Norway. It was the effective end of the Viking Age, the last great Norse invasion of England crushed in one bloody afternoon. Harold's victory at Stamford Bridge was remarkable. But it came at a terrible cost. His army was battered, exhausted, and still licking its wounds when, just 3 days later, William of Normandy landed on the southern coast at Pevensey. The timing could not have been worse if Harold had planned it himself. Now Harold had to force march his army all the way back down to face William. He did it, but the troops were weary, and many reinforcements hadn't yet arrived. William, meanwhile, was fresh, well-prepared, and backed by the Pope's blessing. Yes, William had cleverly framed his invasion as a holy mission, turning it into something of a papal-approved crusade. Nothing like divine endorsement to boost morale. The two armies met on October 14, 1066, near the town of Hastings. The battle lasted all day. Harold's forces, mostly infantry, formed a solid shield wall on the hill. William's forces, a mix of cavalry, archers, and infantry, hurled themselves against it again and again. For hours, the English line held firm. It looked as though Harold might actually win, despite everything. But William adapted. His cavalry began feigned retreats, luring parts of the English line into breaking formation, where they were cut down. Slowly, the shield wall weakened. And then came the moment every English schoolchild knows: Harold, struck in the eye by an arrow. Or at least, that's what the Bayeux Tapestry suggests. In reality, it might have been a sword, a spear, or just a general melee. But the arrow in the eye version stuck, partly because it's such a memorable image. With Harold dead, the English resistance collapsed. William won the day. The Norman conquest had begun. Now, let's be clear. The Battle of Hastings wasn't just a military defeat. It was the end of Anglo-Saxon England as it had existed for centuries. The ruling elite was wiped out. Lands were confiscated and handed to Norman barons. The language of government shifted from Old English to French. Castles, unknown in England before, sprang up everywhere as symbols of control. It was a total transformation, like waking up and finding someone had changed the locks on your house and redecorated all the rooms. William, soon styled the Conqueror, wasted no time consolidating power. He marched to London, intimidated the remaining nobles, and had himself crowned king on Christmas Day, 1066, in Edward's brand new Westminster Abbey. The symbolism was deliberate. William wasn't just a foreign invader, he was now the rightful successor, cloaked in the trappings of tradition. Of course, not everyone accepted this peacefully. Rebellions flared across the country, especially in the north. William responded with a campaign of devastation known as the Harrying of the North, in which entire regions were burned, crops destroyed, and populations starved. It was harsh, brutal, and effective. Resistance dwindled. By the early 1070s, William's grip on England was secure. And so, with one battle, one arrow, and one ambitious Norman duke, the old Anglo-Saxon world ended. The England that emerged was still recognizably English, but transformed linguistically, socially, and politically. A fusion of Anglo-Saxon and Norman cultures that would eventually produce something new. But let's linger on Harold for a moment. The last Anglo-Saxon king of England, dead on the battlefield, his dynasty shattered. He had ruled for less than a year, yet in that short time had fought off the last great Viking invasion and then fallen to the Normans. His reign was brief, frantic, and tragic. The kind of reign that might have been heroic if it hadn't been so utterly doomed. And let's linger on William, too. The Conqueror. A man who turned a disputed promise into a throne. Who swapped a duchy for a kingdom. And who reshaped England in ways that no one at the time could fully imagine. So, 1066. A year of 2 invasions, 3 battles, and 3 kings. A year that ended one chapter of English history and began another. A date forever etched into memory, not because anyone particularly enjoys it, but because it marks the moment England was conquered, remade, and set on a new path. And with that, the Anglo-Saxon age is over. The Normans are here to stay.